Well, well, well. Look who got a microphone. Pretty fancy. Today I want to talk about Edward. I got a lot of really lovely comments on my last video about what customs people want me to talk about. Today I'm going to talk about Edward. I think it just makes the most sense to talk about next. So let's just get straight into it. Let's do it. When I first conceptualized making Railway Series style versions for all the main characters, I thought Edward would be really easy because all you need to do is give him a black running board and then boom, you've got yourself a Railway Series style Edward. He's depicted pretty consistently between the books, the show and the merchandise, so it didn't seem like there would need to be much modification. Edward is supposedly based off a Furness Railway K2 class engine. I was never really the biggest fan of this, simply because I didn't really like the cab. The cab feels very James coded to me. I personally like the idea of Edward being a GNSR Class V. They have the classic Edward cab with those two rectangular windows and the correct shape and wheel arrangement. They were built in the late 1800s and early 1900s, which lines up with the timeline of the stories. They were sold off around the turn of the century, so you could easily argue that the Fat Controller bought Edward around that time. You could even change Albert to be a GNSR G10 to fit the continuity that they were on the same railway. Victoria and Helena could be GNSR coaches. I'm not very good with my railway history, but I think the GNSR coaches were typically either brown and cream or just brown, which is coincidentally very similar to the museum coach that Toby pulls in Toby Feels Left Out. So I guess in this universe, Toby's vintage train would look like this, which I think is kind of cool. You know, what's more vintage than a museum coach? So it sort of works out. With all that being said, I didn't really have a specific basis in mind when making my Edward. I just wanted him to look similar to the illustrations and other realistic interpretations of the character. I had seen some people paint the underside of the boiler black to imply that there's nothing there. I like doing that. I've done it with my Donald and Douglas. I did it with the first attempt of my James. But I felt it looked a bit weird for Edward because his boiler is so high up and the black part ends up cutting off like half of his boiler. But that got me thinking, what if there actually was a gap underneath his boiler? I drew up this Photoshop and I gave it a go. I used the same cylinder that I used for the James boiler because they're about the same diameter. I cut the plastic off to make way for the cylinder. There was a bit of plastic on the running board that housed a screw to hold Edward's body in place, which I needed to cut off, but that doesn't affect how the body sits on the footplate. He still holds together fine. I filled the hole where the screw used to go with putty and smoothed it over with some sandpaper. Once I glued the cylinder part on, all I needed to do was putty it and sand it all down. I also extended the lining using toilet paper in the same way that I did for James. I had to putty really carefully here so the lining looked like one smooth strip. I was pleasantly surprised how this turned out. I don't have any specific tips when it comes to puttying and sanding. All I can say is that it takes multiple layers of putty before it looks smooth. I often need to undercoat the engine so I can actually see if it looks smooth, because then it's all one colour. When some parts of it are blue and the other parts are grey, it's quite hard to tell. It takes a really long time and it can be a bit frustrating when you're sanding something down and then suddenly the bump randomly appears. It will drive you a bit insane, but you need to just be patient, I suppose. There's actually a small gap underneath Edward because the diameter isn't the perfect size, but you can't tell that from any normal angle. I tend to apply putty with a knife in the same way you'd butter your toast in the morning. This gives it a smooth finish and it makes life easier when it comes to sanding it down to be as smooth as possible. With all the plastic being removed from the underside of the boiler, I had to shave away some of the excess plastic around the motor. The motor is actually visible now from the front. I painted it blue to help it blend in. This is an older piece of merchandise, so the motor is broken anyway, but I made sure not to mess with any of the gears, so in theory, he could run if the motor wasn't dead. Looking back at these photos, perhaps it was best to keep the motor black to draw attention away. What do you think? After that, I just needed to paint him. The blue I used was Aussie Export Sky Blue, which I've used for my other blue engines like Gordon and Thomas. It's very similar to the merchandise. Same as my other engines, I used matte black for the running board and a gloss black for the cab roof and the smoke box. I painted the underside of his footplate matte black with Humbrol enamel matte black, the same way I did with my Thomases. As I was working on Edward, I felt that there was something missing from him. I couldn't put my finger on it. I happened to see this custom Edward on Twitter, and I thought, now that looks like Edward. But I initially wasn't sure why. Okay, so I was really planning on finding this old image on Twitter. I've searched through all of my followers on Twitter and all of their media content, and I just, for the life of me, cannot find this photo that I'm referring to. It was from a Japanese creator, so I'm not sure what their Twitter handle or what their name was on Twitter. It was a work in progress photo of a Plea Edward that they'd obviously modified. It had a darker shade of blue, it had the K2 style cab, and it had a slightly taller funnel. So if anyone knows who that could have been, I'd love to know. As I said, I've tried really hard to try and find this image and this particular creator, and I just haven't been able to. So if you can just picture that in your head whilst I'm describing this next part of the video, that'd be great. Thanks. So it wasn't the cab that made this feel like Edward. Eventually I realised it was the funnel. This was somewhat mind-blowing to me. It really made me change the way I looked at the engines. I don't know if this is the case for other people, but seeing a tall funnel on an engine makes them look smaller. I understand that's because small engines typically have tall funnels while the large engines have short ones, but I didn't think it completely shifted how I saw an engine. I've seen people change the funnels on their Tomy Trackmaster engines before, but I was always hesitant to do it myself. I thought if you made the funnel too large, it looks a bit strange, like it's sort of breaking the suspension of disbelief that it's a toy. But seeing how Edward looked with just a slightly taller funnel, I was inspired to go back and change the funnels for a bunch of my engines. As you all know, I gave my various Thomases larger funnels. I also changed Oliver's, Ginty's, Donald and Douglas's, Toby's and Barry's. I didn't realise that Tomy, Donald and Douglas are actually really small. They're shorter than Thomas, but the short funnels really made them seem stumpy and large to me. Now they feel more like their characters with the slightly taller funnels, and the same goes for Edward. I replaced Edward's funnel with Thomas's funnel. If there was only one thing you were doing to make an Edward custom, I'd say the funnel was probably the most important thing. I'm very pleased with the model. It's not super different to the original merchandise, but I like that about it. It doesn't need to be radically different. I'm glad I pushed myself to try something I haven't done before with adding the gap under the boiler. I could have easily painted his footplate black and called it a day. I could have figured it would be too hard, but I gave it a crack and I'm pleased with the result. Trying things that I don't think are possible are what make me a better modeler. The one thing that I'm not completely happy with is his neck. I don't really know what the real term is. This part here. It seems a bit thick to me. A lot of depictions of Edward show him with a much thinner neck. If I had my time again, maybe I would try cut it down, but having completed his boiler and repainted him, I'm quite happy to leave him how he is. Let me know what you think of my version of Edward in the comments. What's your ideal Edward look like? Are you a fan of the K2 style cab? Do you have a specific basis for your headcanon for Edward? I'm always really curious to hear people's interpretations, so please let me know. As always, if you made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching. And if you have stuck around for this long, if I may shamelessly plug, if you haven't checked out my story, the Farquhar special, please do that. It's the first original story that I've uploaded, and I'm quite proud of it. I like how it looks. I think it's a nice little story. So if you haven't checked that out yet, please do. And until next time, stay well.